that looked like every other day from the outside. The sky was the same pale gray I'd grown used to. The street below my window carried the same tired rhythm, buses breathing at stops, people moving with their collars up, the smell of damp coats and cheap coffee drifting in from somewhere. I was making tea in my small kitchen, the kind of tea you don't think about. A bag dropped into a chipped mug, a kettle that clicked and hummed, a spoon that had been bent slightly in the middle for years, as if it had also given up on being perfect. When the knock came, it didn't feel like an announcement. It felt like hesitation. I remember thinking I might be imagining it, because life had trained me to expect things to be quiet unless they were bad. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the door. She stood there, a little too still, like someone who didn't want to take up space. She was younger than me by at least a decade, maybe more. Not a teenager, not quite fully settled into adulthood either. The kind of age where you can look older because you've been tired for too long. Her hair was pulled back in a loose way that suggested she had done it without a mirror. Her coat was thin for the weather, not dramatically torn or filthy, just thin. The sleeves a little short at the wrists, the buttons not all matching. She held a small bag at her feet, the kind you'd take for an overnight stay, not the kind you'd take for a new life. Her eyes found mine quickly and then dropped, like she'd already rehearsed being turned away. And then, when she looked back up, I saw it. Not confidence, not insistence, hope. Not the loud kind, not the kind people perform when they want to sell you something. A quiet hope, sitting right there in her eyes as if it was the only thing she had managed to carry without losing along the way. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice sounded careful, like she was stepping on ice. "I know it's late. I didn't know where else to go." For a moment, I wasn't sure who she was. Then memory moved, slow and reluctant, like a drawer that hasn't been opened in years. Her name was Leona. I hadn't said it out loud in a long time, but it rose anyway, the way old names sometimes do when you're not expecting them. Leona. The girl who used to sit behind me in school, the one who always had the same lunch bread, something pale, wrapped in paper. The one who never joined in when we were loud, but sometimes smiled like she wanted to. We had never been close, not properly. Not the kind of close where you know each other's secrets, but we had once shared a silence that felt like understanding. I stepped back without thinking and opened the door wider. "Come in," I said. Her shoulders dropped slightly, as if she'd been holding them up with effort. She picked up her bag and walked past me carefully, looking at the floor as if the floor might suddenly tell her to leave. My flat was small, 2 rooms and a narrow hallway. Nothing decorated with intention. It had always been more shelter than home, and I'd never had the energy to pretend otherwise. She stood near the doorway as if she needed permission to breathe. "Tea?" I asked. She nodded too quickly. "Yes, please, if it's okay." "It's okay," I said. I could feel her watching me as I moved back to the kitchen, like she was measuring the air, trying to understand what kind of kindness this was. There are different kinds, I've learned. Some kindness arrives with strings. Some arrives with questions. Some arrives with impatience. And sometimes, very rarely, kindness arrives the way a chair arrives when your legs are tired. It doesn't ask you to prove you deserve to sit. That was what I wanted to give her, though I wasn't sure I knew how. As the kettle boiled again, my mind went backwards without permission, the way it sometimes does when a familiar sadness walks into your home. I grew up in a place where money was always spoken of like weather, as if it simply happened to us, as if it came and went and we had no say. My father worked when he could, not because he lacked effort, but because the world he lived in wasn't built for steady work. He did deliveries, warehouse shifts, anything that didn't require a proper suit or a proper smile. My mother cleaned houses. She had hands that were always red in winter, cracked from chemicals and cold water, and she still apologized when she couldn't afford school trips. "I'm sorry, love," she'd say, like it was her fault the world had rules. I learned early not to ask for things, not because I was noble, because I didn't like seeing the look that came after asking. That look adults get when they want to give you what you need but can't. It makes a child feel like they are too heavy to carry. So I became light. I became quiet. I watched other children talk about holidays and birthdays and new shoes as if those things were normal and guaranteed. I nodded like I understood. At home, we kept the heating low. We ate what lasted. We learned which shops had discounted bread at the end of the day. My mother could make a bag of potatoes feel like a meal, but even she couldn't make it feel like abundance. I was lonely in a way that didn't have a clear cause. Not the dramatic kind of loneliness, the slow kind. The kind where you're surrounded by people but feel like you're behind glass. At school, I did well. Not because I was brilliant, but because school was the only place where effort had a clear shape. You did your homework. You got marks. You were praised. At home, effort disappeared into bills and tiredness and nothing changing. So I clung to the clean lines of school. The certainty, and I noticed the other children who clung too. Leona was one of them. She sat with her back straight, even when she didn't have to. She never pulled attention to herself. She had a way of smiling that didn't show her teeth, like she'd learned early not to take up space with joy either. Once, when we were about 13, a teacher asked us to write about our dream holiday. Most of the class wrote about beaches and cities and places they'd seen on television. I wrote about a quiet room with clean sheets and a door that locked. Leona wrote nothing at first. She stared at her page for a long time, her pen hovering like she was afraid to commit to wanting something. When the bell rang, she handed in a page with one sentence. I remember it because it looked like it had been dragged out of her. I would like to sleep without listening for footsteps. I didn't tell anyone I'd read it when she dropped the paper near my desk. I just looked at her the next day and she looked away. And in that small exchange, there was something like recognition. We didn't become friends. But after that, we didn't feel entirely like strangers either. Back in my kitchen, I poured tea into 2 mugs and carried them into the sitting room. Leona sat on the edge of the sofa, shoulders tight, hands wrapped around her mug as if it might float away. I sat opposite her in my armchair, the one I'd found secondhand, the one with a sagging cushion that shaped itself to me like an old habit. For a few minutes we didn't speak, not because the silence was awkward, because silence was familiar. Then she took a breath. "I didn't plan this," she said. "Coming here. I just remembered you were kind." The word landed oddly. Kind. I had never thought of myself that way. I had thought of myself as careful, reserved, someone who keeps to the edges of things. But perhaps to someone who had been surrounded by sharpness, carefulness could feel like kindness. "What happened?" I asked gently. She looked down into her tea as if answers might be floating there. "I left," she said. 2 simple words, like pulling a thread. "I left my mom's house, and I don't have anywhere." Her voice didn't shake. It was steadier than I expected, but her hands tightened around the mug. I waited. She tried again. "I thought I had saved enough," she said. "I thought if I just worked and didn't spend and kept my head down, I thought I could build something small. Just a room, just somewhere that was mine." Her throat moved when she swallowed. "But it goes so fast. Money, rent, deposits, everything wants more than you have." I nodded because I knew I'd been there in my own way, not with her exact story, but with that feeling of always being one step behind, no matter how carefully you walked. "I didn't come to ask you for money," she said quickly, as if she could hear the thought forming in my head. "I don't have any. I've got nothing. I can work. I can stop, I said softly. She froze, eyes flicking up, fear rising. I didn't like that I'd done that to her with one word. I softened my voice. You don't have to sell yourself to me, I said. You can just be here. Her eyes stayed on mine for a moment, searching for the trick. Then she nodded once, small. And in that nod I saw how used she was to conditions. How used she was to needing to prove she deserved to stay. That night I gave her a blanket and the spare pillow I kept in the cupboard. She slept on the sofa. I offered her my bed without thinking, but she shook her head immediately, almost panicked. No, she said. No, please. This is fine. So I let her have what felt safe to her. I turned off the lights and went to my room, but I didn't sleep straight away. I lay in the dark listening, not to her footsteps, to the absence of them, to the quiet, and I realized with a strange ache that this was exactly what she'd written when she was 13. Sleeping without listening for footsteps. I wondered what footsteps she had been listening for all her life. In the morning, she was already awake when I came into the sitting room. She had folded the blanket neatly, as if she didn't want to leave evidence that she'd needed it. She stood when she saw me, too quickly, like she was still living by rules that said you must be ready to be judged at any moment. You don't have to stand, I said. She sat again, a little embarrassed. I'm sorry, she said automatically. I put the kettle on and it felt suddenly like my flat had become something else, not just a place I survived in, a place where someone else could survive too. Over the next few days, Leona didn't tell me everything at once. Her story came in fragments, a sentence here, a detail there. The way people speak when they've been ignored too many times and have learned not to waste words. Her mother had never hit her, she said, but the house had been full of something harder to name, coldness, criticism, the constant feeling of being in the way. Leona had been the kind of child who tried to earn love by being useful, cleaning without being asked, making herself small, getting good marks, saying yes. But love never arrived the way she hoped, and as she grew older, the expectations grew sharper. If she wasn't earning, she was failing. If she was tired, she was lazy. If she wanted rest, she was selfish. You start to feel guilty for needing anything, she told me one evening, sitting with her mug between her hands. I knew that guilt. I'd carried it for years like an extra bone inside my chest. She had tried relationships too, she said, but she had chosen people who felt familiar, people who liked her best when she was quiet, people who praised her for not being dramatic. She smiled when she said that, but it wasn't humor, it was recognition. I thought being easy to live with would make people stay, she said, and I felt something in me tighten because I'd thought that too once. We didn't talk about healing. We didn't speak in that language. We spoke in cups of tea and small routines. I showed her where I kept the extra towels. She helped me wash dishes without being asked, and I had to gently tell her she didn't need to earn her place in my home by scrubbing. She found temporary work within a week, a cafe job, early shifts. She left before dawn in her thin coat, and I started leaving it on the radiator at night so it would be warm in the morning. She noticed once and looked at me as if I'd given her a gift too big to hold. I shrugged like it was nothing, because sometimes the smallest kindnesses are the only ones people can accept without breaking. She didn't spend money on herself, not even when she earned her first pay. She handed me a few notes and tried to insist on paying for groceries. I refused. She looked like she might cry, but she didn't. Instead, she nodded and tucked the money back into her bag, and later that day, she bought a secondhand scarf from a charity shop and wore it like armor. I watched her in small moments when she didn't know. How she flinched when someone raised their voice outside, even if it wasn't directed at her. How she checked her phone too often as if expecting a message that would drag her back. How she sat with her shoulders tense like she was always bracing. And I realized something quietly. She came with no money, but she came with hope. And hope, I've learned, isn't soft. Hope is stubborn. Hope is a thing you keep carrying even when it hurts your arms. As weeks turned into months, my flat changed, not in appearance, but in feeling. We began to share meals properly, simple food, soup, pasta, bread with butter that tasted like safety. Sometimes we would watch television in the evenings, not really watching, just letting noise fill the room so the silence wouldn't become heavy. Other times we would sit with books or our phones, each in our own quiet, and it felt strangely peaceful. I noticed my own body soften. I hadn't realized how tight I'd been living, how ready I always was for disappointment. There was something about her presence that reminded me of my own younger self, the part of me that had survived by being small. It made me want to be gentler, not just to her, to myself. One night, after she'd been with me for nearly 3 months, she came home later than usual. Her cheeks were pink from cold. Her eyes looked bright in a way that worried me. She stood in the doorway holding her bag too tightly. I waited because rushing her would only make her retreat. She swallowed. "My mom called," she said. The air shifted. I didn't say anything yet. Leona went on. She said she doesn't understand why I'm doing this. She said I'm ungrateful. She said she's told everyone I've run off. Her voice stayed calm, but her fingers trembled slightly against the strap of her bag. And she paused. I didn't argue, I didn't explain. I just listened. I nodded because that made sense. Because when you've spent your life explaining yourself to someone who doesn't want to understand, eventually you stop offering your throat. She asked where I am, Leona said. And I didn't tell her. Something in her face shifted then. A quiet astonishment, like she hadn't realized she was capable of keeping something for herself. I hung up, she said, and I just stood there for a long time, and I thought, I'm still here. I didn't die from it. Her eyes filled, not with tears that fell, but with that shining pressure of emotion held back. I thought it would swallow me, she whispered, but it didn't. I felt my own throat tighten, because that was what survival often looks like, not a dramatic moment. A small choice, a quiet boundary. A phone call ended without giving away your location. I stood and crossed the room slowly, careful not to startle her. I didn't hug her. I wasn't sure she wanted that. Instead, I placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, just for a second. You did well, I said. Her chin dipped, and she breathed out like she'd been holding her breath for years. Later, when she went to bed, I sat alone in my armchair and stared at the blank television screen. I thought about my own childhood, about my mother apologizing for things that weren't hers to apologize for, about my father coming home with tired eyes and trying to smile, about the way I had learned to make myself small, to avoid asking, to avoid being a burden, and I realized something I hadn't let myself admit. I had been waiting my whole life too. Waiting for proof that I could be safe, waiting for someone to tell me I was allowed to exist without earning it. Leona's presence didn't fix my past. It didn't rewrite anything, but it gave me a new kind of present, a home that held 2 quiet survivors instead of one. She saved slowly, coin by coin, shift by shift. She kept her money in an envelope at first, because banks felt too official, too fragile. Then, after a while, she opened an account and brought home the papers like they were a certificate of adulthood. I did it, she said, holding them out, and the pride in her voice was so gentle it almost hurt. I made a small celebration cheap cake from the supermarket, 2 candles we found in a drawer. She laughed when I lit them. It wasn't a big laugh, just a sound that said she wasn't afraid of joy for a moment. There were hard days too, days when she came home quiet, eyes dull, and sat on the sofa without speaking. Days when she looked at her phone too long. Days when her hope seemed tired. On those days, I didn't push her to talk. I learned that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is not demand a performance of pain. I would make tea. I would sit nearby. I would let her breathe. Time passed, slowly, in the way it always does when you are rebuilding from nothing. One evening, almost 6 months after she first knocked on my door, she told me she'd found a room. Not an apartment, not a fresh start in the cinematic sense, a room in a shared house with a small window and a door she could lock. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Her voice shook slightly as she said it, as if she was afraid saying it out loud would make it disappear. I felt something complicated in my chest. Pride, relief, and a strange grief I hadn't expected, because her leaving would mean she no longer needed my small flat. And I realized I had started to need her presence too, in a quiet way. Not as a dependency, as a reminder that life could change, that people could arrive and not destroy you, that you could open a door and not regret it. We packed her things together on her last day. She didn't have much. A few clothes, some toiletries, a notebook, a scarf. But there was something different about the way she moved now. Less apologetic, less fearful, still quiet, but more solid. When she stood at my doorway with her bag again, it looked less like escape and more like direction. She held the strap with both hands. She looked at me, and her eyes were shining again with that same hope, but it had changed. Before, it had been desperate. Now it was steadier, as if she'd learned hope could be something you build, not just something you cling to. I don't know how to say thank you, she said. You don't have to, I told her. But she shook her head. I do, she said softly, because you didn't make me feel ashamed. The words hit me harder than I expected, because shame had been the language of both our childhoods, and to be free of it, even briefly, was a kind of miracle quiet, unannounced. She stepped forward and, for the first time, hugged me. It was not a dramatic embrace. It was quick and careful, but I felt her exhale against my shoulder. And I realized she had trusted me enough to let her body relax near another person. When she pulled away, she wiped under one eye, annoyed with herself, and then smiled. A real smile this time, teeth visible. It looked unfamiliar on her face, like a light in a room you've only ever seen dim. I'll come by, she said, if that's okay. It's okay, I said, and then she left. The door closed with a soft click. For a moment, the flat felt empty in a way that echoed. I stood there longer than I needed to, listening. Not for footsteps, for the quiet after them. That night, I made tea out of habit and sat alone on my sofa. The cushions still held the faint shape of where she used to sit. I looked around my small rooms, the plain walls, the mismatched furniture, the radiator that rattled when it warmed. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I understood something then that I hadn't been able to understand in my own lonely childhood. Survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about being seen. Sometimes it's about one door opening when you expect it to stay shut. Sometimes it's about a warm coat on a radiator, a mug placed in your hands, a silence that isn't punishment. Leona had come with no money, but she had brought hope in her eyes. And by letting her rest in my life for a while, I had found a small piece of hope in my own. In the weeks after she moved out, she sent messages, simple ones, got the keys, made pasta, didn't burn it. Room is cold, but it's mine. I would smile at my phone and feel a soft warmth in my chest. Not happiness in a loud sense, something quieter, something like understanding, and life continued. Work, bills, rain, the usual weight of days, but there was a difference now. When I passed young women on the street with thin coats and tired eyes, I didn't look away as quickly as I used to. When I heard someone apologize too much in a shop, I felt that familiar ache and also a gentle anger at how normal it had become. When I found myself shrinking in conversations, trying to be easy, trying to be small, I noticed it sooner. Sometimes I would put my hand on my own chest, just lightly, and remind myself, you don't have to earn your right to exist. You can just be here. There was no grand lesson, no neat ending. Leona did not become rich or famous or suddenly free of all pain. I did not become transformed into a different person overnight. We were still the same two people shaped by years of quiet hardship, but we had moved slightly, shifted, made room. And that was enough. One evening, months later, she came by with a small plant in a pot. "Housewarming gift," she said, placing it on my windowsill. It was nothing special, just green leaves and soil, but it felt like a symbol of something I didn't have words for. She stood in my doorway again, but this time she didn't look like someone waiting to be turned away. She looked like someone who belonged somewhere. We drank tea. We talked about work and weather and small annoyances. We laughed once softly at something trivial. And when she left, the door closed gently behind her. I went back to my armchair and sat for a while, looking at the plant on the windowsill. Outside, the street carried on. People hurried home. Lights flickered in windows. The world didn't pause to acknowledge anything. But inside my small flat, there was a quiet kind of dignity, the kind you build slowly, day by day, the kind that doesn't need an audience, and I realized in the calm after the day that hope doesn't always arrive like a sunrise. Sometimes it arrives like a knock you almost don't hear. Sometimes it stands in your doorway with a thin coat and a small bag. Sometimes it looks at you with tired eyes and asks, without demanding to be allowed to rest. And sometimes, if you open the door, you both survive a little more gently after that.